Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to the EC2 Summary. So congratulations, you're at the end of another section of the course. Hopefully you've learnt an awful lot. The first thing we learnt about was what EC2 is. It's basically just a resizable compute capacity in the cloud, or it's a way of provisioning virtual machines in the cloud. And it reduces the time required to obtain and boot new servers instances to minutes rather than hours or days or weeks or months, depending on where you work. And it allows you to quickly scale capacity both up and down as your computing requirements change. So we have four different pricing models for EC2. We've got on demand, and this is where you pay a fixed rate by the hour or by the second with no long-term commitments. We then have reserved. This is where you have a capacity reservation. Contract terms are 1 year or 3 years. The more you pay up front and the longer the contract term, the more discounts you get. We then have spot. This enables you to bid whatever price you want for instance capacity, and it basically moves around like the stock market. And we then have dedicated hosts, and this is physical EC2 servers that are dedicated for you. And this can be useful where you've got existing server-bound software licenses or perhaps regulations saying that you cannot use multi-tenant virtualization. Do remember going into your exam that if a spot instance is terminated by EC2 because the price has changed, you're not going to be charged for that partial hour of usage. However, if you terminate the instance yourself, you are going to be charged for any hour in which the instance ran. We then looked at our different EC2 instance types, and we came up with the mnemonic Fight Dr. McPixie AU, so in Austin or in Australia, depending on what you want. So there's Dr. McPixie. She's clearly a pixie because she's got wings. She's clearly Scottish because she's wearing tartan. She wants to fight. You can see there's a stethoscope around her, so Fight Dr. McPixie. And like I said earlier, you don't really need to understand every single EC2 instance type going into this exam. Where it does become more useful is when if you go on to do the professional level exams, they will test you as to whether or not it's a valid instance type or not. Moving on to EBS, we learned that EBS is basically a virtual hard disk drive in the cloud. So termination protection for EC2 is turned off by default. You can go ahead and turn it on, and that means someone won't be able to accidentally delete your EC2 instances. On an EBS-backed instance, the default action for the root volume is to be deleted when the instance is terminated. And we saw that every time we terminate an EC2 instance, the volume itself gets deleted, the root device volume, but any additional volumes will persist. So that is something to watch out for. If you have an EC2 instance with multiple virtual hard disk drives, so multiple EBS volumes, when you go in and terminate that EC2 instance, the root device volume, the volume that the operating system is installed at, will be deleted automatically, but the other volumes will persist. And then EBS root volumes of your default AMIs cannot be encrypted. You can use a third-party tool such as BitLocker in Windows, for example, to encrypt the root volume. All this can be done when creating AMIs. It says their lab to follow, but we did do the lab, and we will cover off the steps involved to encrypt our root volume in a second. And then also we learnt that additional volumes can be encrypted. So when we go in and provision our EC2 instance for the first time, we can't encrypt the root device volume, but what we can do is any additional volumes we can encrypt right from the very start. Moving on to security groups, all inbound traffic is always blocked by default. All outbound traffic is allowed. Changes to security groups take effect immediately. So as soon as you open up port 80, that takes effect immediately. And then you can also have any number of EC2 instances within a security group, and you can have multiple security groups attached to EC2 instances. And we did that when we went into the EFS lab. We attached our default security group as well as our web DMZ security group as well. Moving on to, again, staying on security groups. So security groups are stateful. That means that when you open up a port, so if you open up port 80, it's going to be open for both inbound and outbound traffic. Network ACLs are stateless. When you go and do a network ACL, you're going to have to open up port 80, both inbound and then also outbound. So we're going to cover that off in the VPC section of the course. If you create an inbound rule allowing traffic in, that traffic is automatically allowed back back out again. And you cannot block specific IP addresses using security groups. Instead, you're going to be using network access control lists. And again, we will see that in the VPC section of the course. And you can always specify allow rules with security group, but not deny rules. Then we looked at EBS. These are the different EBS types. So we've got general purpose SSD or GP2. We've got provisioned IOPS SSD, which is IO1. So those are our two different flavors of SSD. And essentially, if you want your IOPS to go above 16,000, you want to move from general purpose over to provisioned IOPS. We then have hard disk drives. So we've got three different types. We've got throughput optimized hard disk drives or ST1. We've got cold hard disk drives or SC1. And then we've got EBS magnetic, and this is sometimes referred to just as standard as its API name, and that typically is previous generation, so you might not see that in the exam. With the throughput optimize and cold hard disk drive, basically if you need to optimize throughput, choose throughput optimize. If you just want the lowest cost storage available, use cold hard disk drive. So staying on EBS, volumes exist on EBS, so just think of EBS as a virtual hard disk drive in the cloud. Snapshots exist on S3, and I want you to think of snapshots as a photograph of the disk, and snapshots are actually point-in-time copies of the volumes, and snapshots are incremental, so this means that only the blocks that have changed since your last snapshot are moved to S3. And if you take your snapshot for the first time, it may take some time to create. That's because it's doing its very first one, but then it will only replicate. If you take a second snapshot, it's only going to replicate the deltas, so it's only going to replicate the changes. To create a snapshot for Amazon's EBS volumes that serve as root device volumes, you should always try and stop the instance before taking the snapshot. That will give you a consistent snapshot, but that is optional. You can take snapshots on running instances as well. And you can create AMIs from both volumes and snapshots. And you can actually change EBS volume sizes on the fly, including changing the size and the storage type. And volumes will always be in the same availability zone as the EC2 instance. So you cannot have an EC2 instance in one availability zone and then an EBS volume in another. Bear that in mind as well. In terms of migrating EBS, so to move an EC2 volume from one availability zone to another, you just take a snapshot of it. You then create an AMI from the snapshot, and then you use the AMI to launch that EC2 instance in a new availability zone. And likewise, if you want to move EC2 volumes from one region to another, take a snapshot of it, create an AMI from the snapshot, and then copy the AMI from one region to another. And then you use the copied AMI to launch the new EC2 instance in the new region. Encryption: snapshots of encrypted volumes are encrypted automatically. Volumes restored from encrypted snapshots are encrypted automatically as well. And you can share snapshots, but only if they are unencrypted. And you can share snapshots with other AWS accounts, or you can actually make them public as well. EBS versus instant store. So instant store volumes are sometimes referred to as ephemeral storage. Instant store volumes cannot be stopped. If the underlying host or hypervisor fails, you're going to lose your data. And EBS-backed instances can be stopped, however, and you won't lose the data on this instance if it's stopped. And you can reboot both and not lose your data. And by default, both root volumes will be deleted on termination. However, with EBS volumes, you can actually tell AWS to keep the root device volume from being deleted. So you can you basically stop it from automatically being deleted. In terms of encrypting root device volumes, how do we do it? Well, we created a snapshot of the unencrypted root device volume. We then created a copy of the snapshot, and when we did that, we selected the encrypt option. We then created an AMI from the encrypted snapshot, and then we used that AMI to launch the new encrypted instances. So that's how we basically encrypt our root device volumes using the AWS console. Don't forget, you can also do it using just software like BitLocker, etc., etc. Moving on to CloudWatch. Remember that CloudWatch is used for monitoring performance. CloudWatch can monitor most of AWS as well as your applications that run on AWS. CloudWatch with EC2 will monitor events every 5 minutes by default. However, you can have 1 minute intervals by turning on detailed monitoring. And you can create CloudWatch alarms, which then go ahead and trigger notifications. And CloudWatch is all about performance. CloudTrail is all about auditing. We're going to have another slide of that coming up. So what can you do with CloudWatch? Well, you can create dashboards, and this will allow you to see what's happening within your AWS environment all around the world. You can create alarms, and this allows you to set alarms that notify you when a particular threshold is hit, like 80% or 90% CPU utilization. We can monitor events, so CloudWatch events helps us to respond to state changes in our AWS resources, and you can also use logs, CloudWatch logs, to help you aggregate, monitor, and store your logging data. And like I said, CloudTrail versus CloudWatch. CloudWatch monitors performance, so think of someone at the gym. CloudTrail monitors API calls in the AWS platform, so CloudTrail will tell you who provisioned an EC2 instance or who set up an S3 bucket, etc., etc. We then learned about the command line, so you can interact with AWS from anywhere in the world using the CLI. You are going to need to set up access in IAM. This gives you an access key ID and secret access key. The commands themselves are not in the exams, but some basic commands will be useful to know for real life. We then looked at roles, because we looked at on our EC2 instance what happens if somebody goes into our secret directory, our .aws directory, which is in our home directory, and then opens up our configuration details. They'll be able to get our access key ID and secret access key. So roles are a much more secure way than storing your access key ID and secret access key on individual EC2 instances. Roles are much easier to manage, and roles can be assigned to an EC2 instance after it's been created using both the console and the command line. And roles are universal. You can use them in any region in the world. We then went on to Bootstrap scripts. Bootstrap scripts run when an EC2 instance first boots and can be a powerful way of automating software installs and updates. So we've used it a little bit in this course so far. We're going to use it a lot, certainly in the next section. We're going to create a Bootstrap script that installs WordPress, and we're going to use that to connect to our RDS instances. So Bootstrap scripts are incredibly useful as well. We then learnt about instance metadata and user data. So it's used to get information about an instance such as a public IP. And to do it, you just run a curl and then 169.254.169.254/latest/metadata. If you want to get your user data is literally your Bootstrap script that is passed to your EC2 instance when it first boots up. And again, you just run a curl 169.254.169.254/latest/ and then user data. Moving on to EFS, that was the very last lab. So we learned that it supports the Network File System version 4 or NFS v4 protocol. You only pay for the storage that you use. You don't need to pre-provision, so you don't need to go in and spin up an 8 gig instance or something like that. It basically grows as you put more files on it and can scale all the way up to petabytes, and it can support thousands of concurrent NFS connections. And remember, if you need shared storage, you can't share EBS with multiple EC2 instances. Doesn't work like that, but you can create an NFS EFS mount, and then you can store your files in there, and multiple EC2 instances will be able to access it. And with EFS, data is stored across multiple availability zones within a region, and in terms of the consistency model, you get read after write consistency. And then finally, moving on to placement groups. Just remember there's two types of placement groups. You've got your clustered placement groups. This is where you need very high network throughput or low latency or both, and it's available in a single availability zone. And then you've got your spread placement groups. This is where if you've got critical EC2 instances and you don't want them on the same hardware, then you create a spread placement group. Clustered placement groups can't span multiple availability zones, whereas spread placement group can. The name you specify for a placement group must be unique within your AWS account. Only certain types of instances can be launched into a placement group, so this will be compute optimized GPU instances, memory optimized, or storage optimized. And AWS always recommend that you have homogeneous instances within placement groups, so this means that you don't want to have different EC2 instance types inside your placement groups, although you can. AWS just recommend against it. You can't merge placement groups, and you can't move an existing instance into a placement group. You have to create an AMI from your existing instance and then launch the new instance from the AMI into your placement group. So that is it. You are at the end of the EC2 section of the course. I hope you had lots of fun. In the next section of the course, we're going to look at relational database services, or RDS. We're going to be using WordPress, which will be using a backend MySQL instance. And again, you're going to get a lot more hands-on fun with AWS. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.